please stand. We'll do like, we have some instructions to get started.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, everyone. I just want to recognize a couple people. Tiffany, Sheena, and Valerie James are here with the party, just helping us get some things set up. Tiffany, if you want to raise your hand, is collecting, if you have questions you want to write down on a card. There's some cards back there and pens. We're definitely going to try to answer your questions, and the best way to do it is to send them up here. I can kind of sort through them that way there's not repeat questions, and then I'll ask the questions to our legislators here. So please raise your hand if you have that, or find Tiffany. Also want to recommend we have a couple of A County commissioners with us, Commissioner Bailey and Beck. I guess you want to say hello. Hopefully, hello. Commissioner Davidson didn't show up, and we have a meeting. But, my name is Doug Taylor. I'm a member of the Region City Council. I was asked to sort of moderate and facilitate the discussion. Round of applause. But happy to be here and happy to facilitate some of this discussion tonight. Feel free to come and go as you need to. Restrooms are out to the left of the men, to the right is the women's. You don't need to raise your hand and ask for permission. You can just go. With that, we'll go ahead and just kind of get started. Like I said, this is sort of a forum, an opportunity to learn a little bit more about what our legislators from District 21, what they did during the session, some of their observations, and to answer some of your questions that you might have to give them an opportunity. And I'll just say, I've known these three for a number of years. They've been incredibly accessible. They've tried to create opportunities for constituents to ask questions. So I really appreciate your willingness to engage and answer questions. I think most legislators are pretty open and try to do that across the state, but I know in District 21 we have some really good ones that try to make an opportunity pretty regularly. So really grateful for their good work and how they represent. So while you're writing some questions, I have a couple just to kind of get started. Sort of an open-ended question. Maybe we can start, whoever wants to start with Ehlers or Senator Bernt. As we look back on the legislative session for the 2026, kind of curious your take on what you saw as one of the best outcomes of the session, and then maybe one of your biggest disappointments from the session. Just open-ended, whatever it could be a personal issue you were working on, or it could be a sort of broader issue. Whatever you feel you'd like to answer that. You could kind of each take an opportunity to tell us, tell us one of the best things and the sort of biggest disappointment from your perspective.
Thank you. Can you guys hear me okay? Am I open?
Hello. There we go. There we go. First off, I want to say thank you for you all coming. I know that there's a lot of things going on in the evenings, family stuff, community stuff, church stuff. So thank you for being here. Thank you for Chairwoman Tiffany Tishida for putting this on and being our leader, and all of the volunteers and the precinct committee folks who are dedicated in making sure that D21 is represented. To answer the question, I'm going to go a little bit personal. This last legislative session, there was a lot of stuff on public lands, and I think Representative Petzke carried a bill in the House, and there was a Senate bill that were constitutional amendments to our state constitution regarding public lands, and I ran a joint memorial on public lands. I'm an avid outdoorsman. I love to fly fish. I love to hunt. I'm not good at it. Representative Petzke is. I'm terrible, but I enjoy the mountains. I enjoy recreating. It's how I grew up. It's who Idaho is. And I'm proud to say that joint memorial passed unanimously in the Senate. Had a tougher road in the House, but eventually passed in the House, and it's the only piece of legislation. Well, I would say it's I guess it is. It's a non-binding piece of legislation because it is a memorial, not a bill, that passed the state legislature this year. I'm really proud of it, and I think that we as Idahoans, this is a bipartisan issue. All Idahoans, love public lands, and it's something that we all can agree on. One of the things I was disappointed in was the JFAC process. And we do have a JFAC member here on the dais, so I'm not going to talk too much about it. But I think that we could have done a better job. And this is not related to any member on JFAC personally, but I just think that we could have done our budgets a little differently. As a business owner, when I look at my budget, I'm looking out here in the islands, and I see a lot of small business owners as well. We don't take arbitrary numbers to the bottom line to cut our budgets. We look at our budgets selectively with a scalpel, and we figure out what our inefficiencies are, and we fix them. And I believe that we missed the mark, and I think that we could have done a better job with our budgets. I think we could have been a lot more transparent with our budgets. And going forward, I hope that the co-chairs of JFAC will learn from the huge mess this last year was. Maybe agree on some joint rules. My green light's on. I think it's maybe agree on some joint rules and really do a better job at finding out how we can be better and where we can save money. I'll let James talk a little bit more about that because he's on JFAC.
Yeah, I can start with that, talking about the JFAC stuff, because the JFAC stuff, obviously coming into session this year, we all knew that it was going to be a very different year. That the three of us had certainly experienced before, and that, it kind of becomes normal. The state has been running massive surpluses year after year after year, and that was kind of fun for us, right? Because we have to do all the things. We have to say we're going to invest in infrastructure, and we're going to do tax cuts, and we're going to do teacher raises, and do all the things. And that was a fantastic time, but of course, that can't go on forever. This year was a lot tighter, so we had to make cuts. I'd say for me, like, as we talk about biggest disappointments in the session, it's not necessarily where we ended up. I think we actually ended up in a pretty good place in our budget. It was more of a frustration with how we got there. Like, for example, we did a very across the board big cut. The governor did it first, and then we doubled down and did it more. And to me, that approach to budgeting, kind of to what Treg was talking about, doesn't make a lot of sense. If I was looking at my household budget and I knew I had to make a cut to my household budget to balance my budget, I would say, okay, I'm going to pay 5% less on my mortgage and 5% less on my utilities and 5% less on my grocery bill, right? Like, I would find the things that I can cut out individually and keep the things whole that need to stay whole. So I had a little bit of frustration with the process and how we got there. But I do think that we ended up in a good spot overall once we kind of went through the process and had some of those battles and restored some of those things that were necessary and accepted some of those really critical things. So I think we got to an okay place, but it was a little bit frustrating on the way there. As far as other big wins, I think at least for me this session, I had a couple good pieces of legislation that were very sportsman friendly. I'm a hunter and very involved in some of the sportsman's issues that we have. And so, for example, passed a piece of legislation that changes so that in order to get a lifetime hunting license in Idaho, you have to have lived here for 5 years. There are people, believe it or not, who are moving to the state and taking advantage of the system, only living here for 6 months and then getting a lifetime hunting license. And then that gave them exclusive access to certain tags, and they were essentially using that to cheat the system. So we ran a bill to fix that loophole. Also ran another one around hunting technology, which became a really controversial issue with fishing game in the last year, around the use of night vision and thermals and transmitting trail cameras and drones for hunting purposes. The reality is, allowing those technologies, hunter success rates go up, and then hunter opportunity has to go down, right? All of us will get less tags because we'll be more successful in the field. And so I want to make sure that hunter opportunity stays high in Idaho and can continue to exercise their constitutional right to hunt and fish. And so I think getting that legislation passed will hopefully guarantee that in the future. Yeah, that's the off button. Oh, there we go.
I think it's time.
Yeah, I think my time's up, so I'll pass it on to Jeff.
Thanks, James. I'm Jeff Ehlers, and it's an honor and privilege to serve all of you, and it's good to see so many of you out here tonight. I've heard, I think, from a lot of you during the session as I look out at your faces. I appreciate the input, emails, and the phone calls that we received during the session to help us understand how we could represent you better. So thank you for that. This session, as was mentioned, was all about the budget, particularly budget cuts. And I think we actually did end up in a pretty good place in terms of our bottom line, being able to balance the budget, which is our constitutional duty, and not make it squeak by. So I think we did a good job there. Personally, I like to focus on lowering your taxes and deregulating, and I think I'm building up a strong track record there at this capital of doing that. This year I was able to get 21 bills signed that I carried by the governor. And when I'm down there at the Capitol working, I want to work hard for you. And so I put in the effort, I put my nose down and get to work on your behalf. And one of those bills was the only tax cut that we were able to do this year. I don't know if we're going to talk about tax cuts later for me, but okay. That I think is one that I was glad we were able to get through and see through the end. One of the disappointments, I think, there's a handful of bills I still want to work on around deregulation that I'll work on next year. Maybe we'll get a chance to talk about those for the future. But one of the things I thought was transportation, that we had to cut back on that, where we were talking about making cuts and thinking about long term. That's one of those things maybe you can cut back right now, but in the future, as we've seen how much the valley has grown and the state has grown, that can come back to bite us in the future. So I think that's an area we'll need to look on into the future.
Let's represent Ehlers. I want to stay with you. This next question. One of the first big issues that you tackled was tax conformity with the One Big Beautiful Bill. Can you explain a little bit what tax conformity means for Idaho with respect to the federal tax changes? And then talk a little bit about how that challenged the legislature when we were talking about numbers. And then the next question, I'm going to ask the budget related question to Representative Petzke. So if you can explain tax conformity and what the challenges were this year, since you were a big part of that process.
Yes, so tax conformity normally is just kind of a rubber stamp type of deal, but this year it was important. Why tax conformity matters, in Idaho, what we say is we take your federal taxes and use those as a starting point for your state taxes. If we don't do that, you have to basically restart the whole process when you get to your state taxes. It costs you more time than it already does, more money to figure it out, a lot more laws on our books. It's way more complex. So we say, hey, we're going to start with what the federal does and then tweak it. This year, with the One Big Beautiful Bill, that passed in July, it went retroactive back to 2025. And it's actually only for 4 years. And so you were going to get those taxes on your federal return, but for Idaho, we needed to be what's called conform with that for you to get those starting when you file your taxes right now this year. Or else you'd miss out like 1/4 of the tax benefits from the Trump tax cuts in the One Big Beautiful Bill. So we were able to get that passed. There were a lot of debate, a lot of estimates around how much that would cost. We looked at a lot of outside resources to figure that out and finally settled on a number we thought that could fit within the budget this year based on our revenue projections. And we were able to do that. So what that means for you, for your neighbors, for your kids, is lower taxes, on average several $100s per Idahoan, but especially for those, this is where we're talking about the no tax on tips, no tax on overtime. Those were some of the big winners. So if you have a job like that or someone you know that works in those types of fields, they're going to see a really big benefit. There's a big benefit to senior citizens as well in that One Big Beautiful Bill. So these are real dollars going back in real Idahoans' pockets. It wasn't targeted towards business. It wasn't targeted towards the wealthy. It was very much truly like a citizen's tax break. And so we were able to get that done this year. And I think that's one thing that was really important that came out of this session.
So with that, I'm going to hand the mic to Representative Petzke. So tax conformity came with a big price tag. You're on the Appropriations Committee in the House, JFAC, it's the Joint Finance and Appropriations Committee. So you spend most of your time setting budgets. Can you talk a little bit about tax conformity, how that kind of factored into the overall state budget picture?
Yeah, so the big thing with tax conformity from a budget perspective is that the number that's going to cost the state is kind of an unknown. And that's what made it hard from a budgetary perspective, right? And so Representative Ehlers and others who worked on this issue, they came up with essentially the best guess, but we really don't know for sure because we never tracked things like tips and overtime and vehicle interest before. So we don't know exactly how much of a tax break those are going to be. They have a pretty good guess, but we don't know exactly. So we're going to find out in a couple months for sure what that number is going to be. And the estimate that we worked off of was $155 to $175 million per year. And that's what we baked into our budget. If that number comes in and it's actually significantly higher than that, like there are other entities outside of the state government that are estimating it's a lot higher than that, and it could be, we don't know. And if that ends up being the case, that's where we can end up in a little bit of a budget struggle. We did leave ourselves a pretty healthy bottom line. So that is one thing that's going to help us. So it would have to be a lot more expensive than we thought it was going to be in order for us to get into trouble, or revenue would have to come in short for another reason for us to get into trouble. The other big piece of that is there's a corporate income tax component to it. Corporate income taxes in the last year, ever since the One Big Beautiful Bill passed for the state, have done some really wild swings. We've had, for example, there was a month, 2 months ago, where we, as a state, collected in total, I was told $1,800 of corporate income tax. That just doesn't make sense, right? Like something clearly was wrong there, that we would only collect $1,800 in income tax. And then we had a month in December where we collected several months. Take your time about it. It does. There we go. And there was a month after December where we collected several months worth of corporate income tax all in 1 month. So anyway, we had some very wild swings in corporate income tax because of the One Big Beautiful Bill. So some of that is still playing out as well. Once we've kind of had a year of this tax conformity thing and One Big Beautiful Bill being in place, we'll have a better idea. We'll be able to have a more stable projection of what it's going to do to our budget. But in the meantime, we're kind of waiting and seeing, right? Like there's a chance that it ends up being way more expensive and that we have to go back in and fix it. Or the governor has to hit the budget stabilization fund to balance the budget temporarily. Those things could happen. I hope they don't. I'm optimistic that they won't, but it is not known at this point.
So just a really quick follow-up on that. Tax conformity, we think costs the state about $155 million this year. Next year, we're thinking it's maybe $175, $180 million. Is that? But when do you think we'll actually know what you think it will be? And do you think it could actually go up quite a bit more than that?
Yeah, great question. We don't know for sure, and Jeff can have some better answers to this than I do. I think we're going to have a pretty good idea in April once people file their returns. Well, I should say in May, because we're going to get the filings will happen this month, obviously, and we'll get that revenue report in May on what exactly happened, and the tax commission will have some of that data. Hopefully, we'll be able to get a pretty good idea at that point. But on the corporate side, it's, they're filing returns on totally different schedules than the average citizen is, and so that stuff won't play out necessarily for a full fiscal year. So it's kind of some unknowns. Do you have anything to add there?
Yeah, one thing I would add on the corporate side is it's about timing. Because they're going to get these tax breaks no matter what. They weren't really necessarily new. The new part was the timing of them. And so in Trump's world at the federal level, they let them take their tax breaks all in year one. And we're spreading those out over 5 years, essentially. And so it's going to wash through the system. The question is, what does the timing of that look like? And that's one of the big uncertainties.
And I think in a year where the budgets are already tight, this is probably a bigger issue than maybe it could have been a couple of years ago. Is trying to absorb $150 million in cuts in revenue is a little bit more challenging this year than when we had $1 billion surplus. Senator Bernt, I have a question here from you from a constituent here. Since you're a former city councilman, this is sort of a local control kind of a question. Really, the question was focused on, it seemed like a lot of the session was attacking or being really aggressive with local city ordinances or county ordinances. Just kind of, what are your thoughts in terms of having those types of mandates on the state? How do you maybe try to balance city and county governance with state governance? And I'll just sort of conclude with the idea that, when we talk about local control, cities and counties are a creation from the state. So there's sort of this, I think it's appropriate to say, hey, here's some rules that we need to conform with. But there's also a strong argument about cities and counties know their constituency best, they understand those challenges. So what is your sort of perception or take on how legislation that seems to be targeting local control, how did that go this session, and how do you think the legislature should balance state and local governance?
That's a real complicated question. And when I've said this on the public record numerous times that you are for local control until you're not. It really is a difficult line to walk. It's very gray. There were some bills this last session regarding affordability with housing that the Senate and the House sponsored worked fairly well with the Association of Idaho Cities and Counties. I think they started off terrible, to be completely honest with you, and they were killed in committee. They found out real quick that they needed to work with the counties and the cities to make sure that they were on board. In fact, at the end of the day, the counties became exempt from these affordability housing bills. But I think that it's just real important that when we're working on legislation, when it deals with locals, that we include the locals. I can't tell you how many times big bills came before us to my committees. Not a legislator walked in my office, not one single time. Compare that to my first session 4 years ago. There was a ton more collaboration. And I don't know why all of a sudden legislators feel it incumbent upon themselves to just shove legislation down everyone's throats. I don't think it's healthy. I think it's divisive, and I don't think it accomplishes much. I think the best type of legislation is when you sit down and talk to people. Whether you're a constituent, whether you're a local business owner, whether you're on the Meridian City Council, whether you're an Ada County Commissioner. Let's have a conversation. I promise you, every single time when I've had someone walk into my office, legislator, lobbyist, elected official, we figure it out. And I think that we need more communication. And when we have more communication, better policy is voted on.
Let's kind of stay along that line. There were a number of housing-related bills that you touched on, so we'll go to our two House members. Can you talk a little bit about what you saw, proposals on trying to address housing affordability with what you saw, and do you agree that the state legislature should engage on those issues?
Yeah, that's a tough one, because you're essentially, what all these bills are doing is riding this fine line between, do we want to have increased density and thereby decrease housing costs, but we do so at the expense of people who live in communities that like the density that they already have. I mean, I live in a suburban area in Meridian that's got a quarter-acre lot, and everybody around me has a quarter-acre lot, and we're not allowed to have ADUs, and nobody's got unit buildings in that neighborhood. And I kind of like that. That's kind of why I chose to live there. I didn't want to live in an area that had another increased density, but I do. And so I ended up voting no on those two bills that came before us towards the end of session. One allowed ADUs by right. So whether or not the city wants to allow accessory dwelling units, you can go build one. And then the other one was an increase essentially in density, so allowing a little bit more multi-unit construction. And I have no problem with communities doing that if the community chooses to do that. I think that's great. I just think it can be a really good way to drive down housing costs, is just to increase density for people. But I also think it's okay to have areas where the communities come together and say, no, we don't want that. That's just not what we want here in Idaho or in Meridian or in a specific neighborhood in Meridian, right? I think that there needs to be a place for the locals to say, no, we don't want that increased density, even if density is a good thing in a lot of cases.
Yeah, maybe one thing I would add along this is, if you look at it like a spectrum, right? And sometimes things swing this far this way, and you gotta move it back that way. And then sometimes the correction swings too far, you gotta move it back that way. In terms of these specific bills, I think there's only one out of the four that I actually voted for, because I thought they pushed things too far back this way. I think housing affordability is a really big issue in our state and in our community here. But I wasn't sure that these ones were had the right balance there for what we wanted to do. So,
One more thing. If you want to solve housing affordability, the price of land needs to come down.
That's simple.
The price of land needs to come down. When I was on the Meridian City Council, I I can't think of one instance where someone came and said, Councilman Bernt, we love the density in our city. It's build more. Never heard it once. I've heard the opposite 1,000 times, right? If we truly want to get serious about housing affordability, the federal government needs to come up with incentive programs for developers and builders to be able to build on property that is less expensive. Because if we don't, of course the realtors are going to be for it. Of course the builders are going to be for it. Because they're building. They're not taking a break. And that's the free market, right? We can't legislate against the free market. So if you really want affordability in housing, you need to do something about the price of the land, or it's never going to come down.
So we're going to switch gears to an issue that some might argue isn't a state issue, but it certainly dominated a lot of the discussion in the legislature with respect to immigration. I got quite a few questions about that here. So maybe what I'll do, instead of trying to go through each one sort of individually, if most people know, you still have to answer the question. There was some legislation on cooperation with ICE. There was legislation related to mandatory E-Verify bills. There was some 287G coordination between state and local officials. There was a lot of different proposals, none of which ultimately ended up being passed. There was a lot of rancor in the legislature and around the state around that issue, social media. So you guys lived it, you experienced it. I guess the question to try to capture a lot here from what we have is, do you see an appropriate role for the state to address these issues with immigration? And a lot of the questions really are driven by illegal immigration, what that means to the state, resources, things like that. And again, a lot of this is federal, but in your perspective, or from your point of view, do you believe the state of Idaho and the legislature should be doing more to address this question of immigration? And if so, where do you think an appropriate role for the state is?
Yeah, that's a really tough one, because our Constitution and our courts have been pretty clear that immigration is a federal issue and that they have supremacy when it comes to immigration enforcement, immigration laws. They're the ones that are supposed to be taking care of this issue. And frankly, Congress has just failed to address this issue for decades. And we got a lot of pressure this year from our federal delegation, from the White House, from a lot of people at the federal level that are saying, hey, you as a state should be doing this. Well, there's limits on what we can do per the Constitution and per the courts. And it's frustrating that they're trying to pass the buck to us and say, oh, you guys go figure it out, when they just haven't been willing to do their job for decades. That's a little bit frustrating to me, and that's why we had some of this legislation. That's why it got so contentious this year. And some of those bills that came forward this year, like for example, the 287G one is really controversial. And essentially what that did is it forced every single law enforcement agency in the state to enter into a cooperative agreement with ICE. Now, some of the law enforcement agencies have already done that. However, there are others, including our Ada County Sheriff, and I'm very supportive of Matt Clifford. He's a fantastic Republican sheriff who's been very strong in immigration. She's a very strong law enforcement officer in our community. And he came to us and told us how much of a problem he had with that specific agreement and being forced into it by state law. And so I had a lot of concerns of us passing a bill that would have forced him to do something that he saw as extremely problematic, especially when he's somebody who is very much, trying to tackle this issue as much as he can in his role. I think we need to be careful when we start taking on issues that really it's Congress that needs to be coming up with a solution to this. It's frustrating when they pass the buck to us. There are instances where we can do things, and I'll be for that when it happens. If we can find solutions, if we can find a role for the state to do some of these things. Like for example, I'm a very strong supporter of ISP at State Police, and they've done some really great cooperation with ICE and with some of those efforts from the Trump administration. I think that's a fantastic thing where we have a role. Let's do it. But when it violates the things that the courts have already said we can't do, and that the Constitution says we can't do as a state, that's where I struggle a little bit.
I agree with the part that we got to push back on the federal government to act. I mean, maybe they're in a Gordian knot here that is really hard to solve. But they're not solving it, and therefore we're seeing the consequences of it. And so when it comes down to impacting our state resources, then I think we do, as protectors of state resources, then we do need to act so that the state resources can go to those that they're intended to go to. And so I think that's why you started to see the state get involved in that. I ended up voting, I think, for all of the immigration bills that came before us. They weren't perfect, but that's what you get in front of us. You get a yes or no vote. And so that's what I went with. I did listen to concerns. We've heard, that was probably one of the biggest topics we heard about this session from people all over Idaho on all sides. I listened to concerns. After I read the bills, I didn't share those same concerns that I heard as I read through the bills. I thought a lot of them were already addressed in the bills, and so I ended up voting for them. But I don't think this is a issue that's going away anytime soon, particularly if we're not getting the federal level to act in the way that they need. So I think we'll keep hearing about this again and again.
I don't have a ton more to add to what's been said. I agree fully with what Representative Petzke and what Representative Ehlers has said. I support our sheriffs 100%. And the vast majority of all 44 sheriffs did not support the 287G bill for the exact reasons that Representative Petzke stated. I think maybe only one or two were in support. I get when you have like a couple of outliers, you know, but when you have over 95% of the county sheriffs in the state of Idaho against something, I think you need to listen. Something's there. I believe in strong borders. I know that Jeff and James do as well. But the federal government has failed us on this issue, 100%. I don't believe in E-Verify. I don't think it works. I think there's a ton of fraud in E-Verify. I know that a situation that happened over in southeastern Idaho where a gentleman was baptized in a church, and all of his buddies were there, and they were all surrounded watching this really important thing happen, the ceremony happen, and they called him by a different name than what everyone thought his name was. Oh, now, why was that? Because he had fake documents, right? So, and he was a product of E-Verify. E-Verify is not a proven source of finding who is here legally and illegally. The federal government needs to come up with a program. We need to fix this issue. We need to, again, strengthen our borders, and we need to come up with workforce visas where folks can work in the United States of America and in Idaho legally.
Here's a question.
Yeah, I know there's a quick question.
Is it related to that? I mean, I think okay, so we're trying to do most of the questions here, but just
So the number one job of the press is to protect us from engaging in domestic form. And so why shouldn't we cooperate with ICE when, instead of you saying they're passing the buck to us, when they're just asking for cooperation so they can do their job? Renee McSherry, and they shouldn't have to go by resources when we're worried about our safety.
Renee, I appreciate your emails. I know that you reached out a bunch of times. We've communicated a lot on email. I appreciate you being here. I believe our local officials are cooperating with us. If you were to sit down with Matt Clifford, if you were to sit down with Kieran Donahue in Canyon County, they'll tell you that they cooperate with ICE. They just don't like the mandates of the resources that come along with it. Exactly what Representative Petzke says. They also work well and have agreements with U.S. Marshals. They work hand in hand with them. I believe that local ICE facility is Jim County. Jim County works hand in hand with ICE. We are working with ICE. Our elected officials are working with ICE. It's just my opinion. It's what I've been told, and I've been told that by the county sheriffs across the state.
this is definitely an issue that will probably keep coming back over and over. A funny but sad story. My first job, I worked in the U.S. Senate, and I was working on a comprehensive immigration bill in 2007.
It's your fault if Pat did that. What did you do, Doug? Did you screw it up?
I didn't make it out of the Senate because someone told me, I don't have another chance to solve immigration until 2013. I thought, that's 5 years away, there's no way. Well, here you are 20 years later, and so that's been fixed. So it's been around for a long time. It's a very complicated issue, and so I'm sure you guys are gonna have to deal with this a lot more over the next little bit. And I'll just capture a lot of the testimony I heard. Resources, is it constitutional, is it not? How do we coordinate for the safety of our citizens? It's a complicated issue, and I'm glad I'm not you guys.
And also, what happens when, there may be, who knows, but there may be a Democratic president in 3 years. We don't know. What happens when we pass a law and we have a Democratic president who's running the show? What does it look like then? Do we change laws because there's a different president running the show? It's far more complicated than what you see on TikTok, I promise.
Switch gears just a little bit. Maybe we'll start with Representative Petzke on this question, but we'd love to know if others have a comment on chime in a little bit. It's related to education. A lot of discussion about trying to hold public education as harmless as we could this year, and a lot of other agencies did take a percentage cut or some across the board cuts that Senator Bernt talked about at the beginning. Specifically, though, this question is wanting to know a little bit more about the dual credit program. You need to change. This is timing out.
How do you do it? You continue to push it?
I think it's timed out, because also I just push back on the button that says push. Oh, give me that. Someone needs to talk to the city councilman about fixing that. Okay. So back to the question. The dual credit program we have in the state, I'm sure I'm getting this. But yeah, we're going to talk about the dual credit program. A lot of kids take advantage of it. It's grown a lot over the years. A lot of high school kids are able to graduate with an associate's degree. Are there concerns about cutting that program and limiting the opportunities for some of these kids? I don't think we cut it this year. Maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong. And what do you see maybe going forward with the support of the legislature on that program?
Yeah, so the question specifically about Idaho Digital Learning Academy.
No, sorry, this is the dual credit program. We can talk about, if you want to talk about the virtual.
So they kind of go together, so maybe I'll hit on a little bit. Yeah, so dual credit is a fantastic thing. I did a bunch of dual credit back in the day. When I was in high school, I was going to graduate college in 3 years instead of 4, saved me a ton of money. And our kids are using it even more, and schools have learned how valuable a resource it is. Kids are graduating with associate's degrees before they get a high school diploma. It's unbelievable how awesome that is. And a lot of that is CTE programs as well, so they're able to go straight into trades jobs. It's been a really good thing for the state. But there were some cuts done. We tried to hold education as harmless as possible. However, one of the biggest recipients of the cuts was our higher education programs, universities, the colleges, career technical education. All of those programs got cut, and dual credit relies on both the high school component of it, of course, in our K-12 schools, but then also the second component is the university, the other trade. That program, of course, also relies on the higher education half of that equation, right? It's dual credit, you gotta have both. And so we did really cut our higher education programs. It was it was the biggest budget that was not exempted from the 5% across the board cuts. I'll be honest, I think that's a mistake as a state. There's a lot of people in the legislature and across the state who don't feel like that we have any kind of a requirement to fund higher education. And they might be technically right about that, but I think they miss the bigger picture. I think that we are going to lose ourselves competitively as a state if we don't fund higher education at all. We could just entirely cut it out of our budget. We'd save 7% on our general fund every year. We'd do tiny tax cut if we did that. But we would fall behind as a state if we did that compared to every other state in the country who is funding their higher education programs. How would a company like Micron look at, exactly, it's a massive economic development. Why would Micron build what they're building there if we didn't have a higher education program like we do? And so I think it's a mistake to underinvest in some of those programs. We did also have a pretty substantial cut to the Idaho Digital Learning Academy this year, and ideally it is one of the places where a lot of kids take dual credit classes. And that was a cut, and there's a lot of backstory here, but the executive branch, as part of their recommended budget, at the very last minute decided to add in a $10 million cut to the Idaho Digital Learning Academy. They literally just made up that number. It wasn't based on any kind of formula. It wasn't based on any kind of, here's the program that we don't like, let's cut that out. They just needed to fill a $10 million hole in their budget. I had a lot of frustrations with that. IDLA is a great program. It's one of the most successful education providers in the state. Gen Prep here, they of course use that program very heavily, and one of the highest performing schools in the state, as Jeff can probably talk about since kids go there. And it's also one of the programs that's used by every single school district in the state to some extent. And we changed some policy that would have cut about $10 million out of the budget, and I think most of that was probably good. There were some changes there that needed to happen, but then in JPAC we took an additional $3.5 million that literally just caps the number of people who can take classes through IDLA, including those dual credit classes. And I think that was a mistake. All we're doing is hurting the student opportunity, and we had plenty of money on the bottom line. We didn't have to do it. We made the session with $235 million almost on the bottom line. So it just didn't feel like that was a necessary cut. And I think that, the reality is IDLA is one of the most efficient education providers that we have. It's actually cheaper to send kids through IDLA than it is to send them through the traditional school system. So I think that one was a little bit of a mistake, but something to work on in the future.
Okay. This question, I'm trying to get through as broad of a selection of questions as I can. Spend all our time talking education and immigration budget stuff. So this is a good question. Wants to know, what is the plan to mitigate any water shortages in the valley, especially as we look at industry coming here? A lot of industrial uses, some of them can be heavy users of water. What does that mean? So how do you, and like all three of you that are chiming, how do we try to balance growth, industrial growth, water use in the state? Kind of an interesting question now with all the rain we had the last couple days, and then with the snowpack today, and just sort of the broader question. So.
And yeah, Bogus got 20 inches of snow in the last 12 hours, so I don't know why we had this question. So it should be problem solved. Yeah, we should all be there right now. No, it's a great question. The $30 million that we set aside for water infrastructure last year, that was one of the budgets that didn't get cut this year, so we are still setting aside money to do water infrastructure. There was also a bill that dealt with water use in data centers, and I think we passed it on our side. I don't know if we gave it on your side or not. Okay, any possible, that's great, yeah. So we did do some to address that. Maybe you guys touch on that more.
Yeah, I think we do have a lot of that money that we passed for water that is saved up, that's sitting in the savings account essentially, ready to be put into use for water projects. So I think that's good and forward thinking. But a lot of that has been looked at for other parts of the state. And if you talk to people heavily involved in water issues here in the Treasure Valley, we might be facing something really serious ourselves soon. So I don't think we should neglect this part of the state as well when we look to fund water projects and what needs to be done. So I think we need to keep our eye on that also.
I don't have a bunch. It's really nice going third. I really like this, how I go third. It makes my life a lot easier. I think we're underfunding water projects. I know that Senator Bernt shop, we had this last year, not this last session, but the previous sessions, $30 million ongoing. It should be far more than that. Far more than that. Senator Cook over in southeastern Idaho is doing a great job trying to bring awareness to raising I think it's the Teton Dam. I don't remember the exact amount of water that would help create or keep it for use. I don't remember what that number is, but it's substantial. We need to invest way more money in our water infrastructure throughout the state.
All right, maybe I'll just speak loudly here. Ours is working, babe. This one died now.
Okay, real quick question. And we are trying to be done as close to 7 as we can, so I'm going to try to get through a few really quick questions here. Probably a pretty good question here. What do you think you've done specifically to help Legislative District 21 be more successful and be better off?
That's a wonderful question, and we're unique in the sense that we're smack dab right in the middle of an urban area, and it's a wonderful thing, but it's also can be sort of looked at as the great state of Ada type of a thing from other parts of the state. I personally have listened to constituents who have called. James and I ran a bill this year that is specific to a downtown Meridian proprietor, business owner. We're going to, we created some legislation that will help expand his business that previously he wasn't able to do. He was capped at a certain level. I had a constituent email me yesterday and wanting to know what we can do about the cost of writing checks. This is no joke. We write 450,000 checks a year at a cost of like $30 a check. Not joking. And so he was explaining to me the math. And so I called, I sent an email to one of the folks in the controller's office, and we're in the middle of right now putting together a committee to look at this. It's a huge priority of the controller. It's a huge priority of mine. And we're going on 10 hours of this being a thing. And this is going to be, this might create tens of millions of dollars in savings for the state of Idaho. And these are things that are coming from District 21. So one thing is that we're always accessible. I love it when I get emails from Renee McSherry and other folks who love me or hate me. It doesn't matter. That have issues with me, or think that I'm doing a good job. And it makes the process more rewarding, and it really does a lot for our district. I'm vice chairman of state affairs. You have a member of JFAC. You have a chairman that sits up on this dais. Not saying that there's a lot of influence, but I think that people look at District 21 as an example of how we work together and get work done. So I'm really grateful for the opportunity to work with these two gentlemen.
Yeah, I would echo what Treg said. You know, I've run a few bills over the years for specifically for some constituents. You know, like the one that we did this year for a constituent who wanted to expand their business. And that's been a big thing for me, trying to, anytime somebody has an issue, they come to me, I want to try to help. And, you know, it's funny in this job, Treg got me thinking, like, we almost never hear from people when they're happy. You're doing a great job, Petzke. We never get that, right? Ever. We only ever get people that are unhappy with us. And that's fine, that's part of it, right? That's, you know, we send to these jobs, that's what we expect. But that really does, and I do appreciate that, because honestly, it does help us do our jobs better when we hear that, we get that feedback, we hear from our constituents. It is super helpful, and I really appreciate that. You know, at 7 o'clock on a Monday night, we've got a great turnout here, and that's consistently been all 4 years that I've been in office. We've gotten great turnouts at these forums, because District 21 likes to be engaged in the process, and you know, it gives us really great feedback on how we do our jobs. One other thing that I would talk about too, you know, specifically for District 21, that's so important for our area, is I've had the pleasure all 4 years of serving on the transportation committee. And man, we are in a hot spot for transportation issues, being by the nature of where this area is. And it's been, man, it's been so awesome, especially serving both on JFAC and transportation. I've gotten to be involved in a lot of those big time investments in road and bridge infrastructure that we've done. All sorts of little transportation policy issues, like one that came up this year that I think is going to be so critical, and that we're going to do a lot more work on in the future, is e-bikes. E-bikes, man, I don't know if it's the same in every neighborhood in our district, but at least in our neighborhood, I mean, there is like a biker gang of kids running around on these little e-bikes, and it is a legal gray area. And they're going 40 miles an hour, and I'm not kidding. My wife and I the other night, we were walking our dog at night in the dark. This was about a month ago, it was during session. And we're walking along, you know, on the sidewalk, and we had a couple kids race by on e-bikes that were probably 12 years old, no helmets, no lights on the bikes, and they were on the wrong side of the road. Somebody's going to get killed if we don't do some common sense reforms on our e-bike laws and, you know, define them properly as when they're a motorcycle, when they're a regular bicycle, when they need to be following certain laws, when you need to be licensed to ride them, when you need to be, I mean, there's a lot of work that needs to be done there, and I have seen that issue become a big deal in Meridian and other urban areas in the state. So it's, you know, it's the big picture transportation ones that, you know, that I think I can really, you know, we've done a lot of work there that I think is really benefited District 21, and it's the little things like e-bikes. I think those are great issues that we've been able to work on the last few years.
Yeah, I would highlight maybe a couple of high-level things that really impact us, and then one in particular. One of those things, right, lower taxes. Even though that affects the whole state, I think that really affects our district and getting you more money back in your pocket. School choice is another one. This area has such great options for school choice and such strong options. I believe in strong public schools and strong school choice. And I'm a supporter of that, and I think that really benefits our district here as well. We have a lot of options here. One specific one that ran last year was to help with dissolving the West Ada Rec District, which is mostly our district boundaries. And they've done their job, they've turned everything over to the city, but they're still a taxing district and they're still impacting your property taxes. And so that's important because it's on your ballot this year when you vote in May to dissolve. So I would encourage you, yes, vote on that. They finished their work, lower your property taxes by voting that way. We don't need another taxing district taking property taxes, but that's something that I helped with last year.
I have a different question for each of you, so we'll kind of go down the line here. First, Representative Ehlers, and let me ask the three questions. If you could talk a little bit about the role of AI in state government with the work that you've done. Representative Petzke, there's a question about, is there a plan to have non-technology hunting seasons as we do for archery and black powder? And Senator Bernt, do you support term limits, and kind of talk a little bit about that? So we'll go AI, hunting, we'll do one more question.
So in the so we have a regular session that we just ended not that long ago, but then during this interim between now and January, we do different kind of interim committees, and I co-chair several of those. One is the AI committee, artificial intelligence, and that has been so fascinating. There's so much to learn about what is going on in our lives with AI. So one of the outcomes that came from that, not necessarily the committee, but those that work on that committee, was how AI should be used in our K-12 education system. I mean, whether you like it or not, it's here and kids are using it. And so we wanted to get our hands around that before it just got out there and got away. And so it created a framework with certain principles, and it involved a lot of the education community, and I credit my co-chair, Senator Cook, for doing a ton of this legwork. For getting the framework right about the principles that we want, and then allowing the local school districts to make the policies around it. And it, some of the things are like, it's not going to eliminate a teacher. We need the teachers there. We need that human interaction. That's important. It talks about age appropriate or maybe, not appropriate things for AI. There's a lot of things that we're involved in there. And so that has strong support on both sides, bipartisanship everywhere. So I thought it was a really good bill that we did.
Okay, the hunting and technology thing is kind of a fun topic for me. I'll admit that I geek out on it a little bit. I won't go too deep. I know, so I'll be very quick. So we did do some limits on technology that can be used in any hunting season. Those are specifically around technologies that, new technologies that are allowing people to find animals that may otherwise couldn't, like night vision and thermals and drones. But then as far as doing seasons that would allow more traditional types of hunting only, we already do have muzzleloader seasons and archery seasons, and a new one that we're going to have pretty soon actually, that's kind of coming out as part of this discussion about technology, is going to be an open sights rifle season. So you can use a centerfire rifle, but you have to use an open sight. You can't use a telescopic sight. I think that's super cool. A great idea, and something that will limit the success rate again on those hunts, and so there will be able to be a little bit more opportunity, more times available. So yeah, something that potentially works.
Are you going to do that? Are you going to take out that scope, Mr. Scope owner? Do I support term limits? I do if bureaucrats also have term limits. Yes! I absolutely support term limits at the federal level. I mean, you have some of these politicians who have been back east for 20, 30, 40, 50 years. Time to move on. When you're 90 years old, when you're 80 years old and you're back there working, I think it's time to hang it up and go hang out with the family a little bit. Locally, state level stuff, Do I support term limits at the state level? Only if bureaucrats have term limits as well. And the reason why I say that is if you get rid of the institutional knowledge that comes with being at the state capitol for 1, 2, 3, 4 terms and you're done, but the bureaucrat's there the entire time. So who really has the power? The bureaucrat has the power. The lobbyist has the power. Sorry, Doug. And not only is he a city council, he's also a really good lobbyist. Give it up. So the bureaucrat has the power. The lobbyist has the power, and that's not something that I support.
So we're still have a lot of questions which couldn't get to. I tried to capture as many as we could with some broader questions for everyone. But as sort of a final question, what do you think is the most important thing for the legislature to address or deal with as we start looking into next year? So over the next year or two, what is the most important issue for the legislature to try to address? And then you can, any kind of closing comments that you want to add into that.
That's a really good question. I think there's going to be some unknown budget issues that we're going to have to tackle. Some things that we don't know quite yet, but within the next couple of months, especially through October, because you're also going to have a big bump in October for those who are waiting, who would defer to pay their taxes until then. So we'll know more. So I think we're not done with the budget. I think that we're going to have to make some more decisions regarding the budget. Whether you like it or not, we need to tackle immigration. You know, I understand it's a federal issue, but we need to come up with something that is meaningful, that is thoughtful, that's constitutional, that Idahoans can get their arms around. I think that it needs to happen, but we need to do it the right way. And those are the two things that go in, some personal things that I think are very important, that we can talk after offline if you're interested.
Yeah, I would agree that on the budget issue, I think that's going to be one that we're going to have to work a little bit more on, not only with the unknowns on tax conformity, but then also I think there's going to be a broader conversation around our infrastructure investments with our current budget level. We've cut a lot of taxes in the last 5 years. We have significantly reduced our income tax rate in the last 5 years, and that's a great thing. I'm very much in full support of that. Right? I voted for all those bills. I think it's a great thing. But if our budget level is going to stay about the level that it's at currently, like if you know we have this COVID bump and then now it's flatlining and we're kind of at this point where we're at, we are not going to be able to do the kinds of infrastructure investments that we've been planning on for years. We eliminated $300 million this year in road work money that had been going every year for 5 or 6 years from the general fund to pay for road maintenance and to do road projects. If we aren't doing those projects, we're going to fall behind as a state, and I think that needs to be a scary thing for all of us who have to drive in traffic every day, and especially for a growing state. So I think that one's a concerning one to me. I think we're going to have some kind of a fix on how we're going to raise that $300 million that we took out of the budget this year. If the budget if we don't see economic growth, and that's just it's an unknown at this point. But I think it's going to be something that we're going to have to address. And then on the other side, I'd say natural resources are a big one that I know I'm going to spend a lot of time on, specifically for plants. A lot of conversations. There we go. A lot of conversations going on at the federal level around public lands. I'm definitely very much a supporter of public lands, and I know our state is very, very, very strong on public lands. Our delegation was awesome this year, or last year, I should say, when that proposal was put forward by Senator Lee in Utah to sell off public lands. Our delegation was fantastic. They stood strong. They said no, public lands didn't get sold. They stayed in public hands. I think that's a great thing, and we need to work on the backside of that. We need to be, making sure that we, as a state, are doing the things that we can do to manage those public lands and make them more accessible to Idahoans and manage the resources as well that are on those lands where we can. So that's going to be something that I'm working on a lot this time. We should talk about it for 10 seconds.
That's a whole other conversation.
Yeah, INL is doing incredible work. I'm a little biased here because my sister works out there, and I've gotten to see some of those things for my whole life, and some of the awesome technologies that are being worked on out there. But if you want to talk about something that the state is going to be very involved in, that is going to be the future of the world, it's the nuclear technology that's going on in INL, and we need to be doing everything that we can to double down on that.
I forgot about that nuclear.
Yeah, a lot of good things have been said here. So I'll just touch on maybe a couple. Some of these are a little nerdy, wonky, but our school funding formula, I think everybody that is involved in that agrees it needs some fixes. That's something that's going to be an issue ongoing. The sales tax distribution formula, interestingly, is also another like super wonky, but something that needs fixing and adjustment. Again, it's archaic. It's from the 60s, I think. Needs looked at. Something else that in particular I want to work on, so I also co-chair in the interim the Doge committee. I'm not sure what that'll look like going forward. At the federal level, it kind of fizzled out after Musk and Trump had their feud. But I think there's still so many more efficiencies at the state government level that we can find. This last session, we, from efforts on the Doge committee, we cut 30,000 words of code. So we simplified code and got rid of archaic, unnecessary, outdated code. So laws, basically, cut our law books. We worked on 6 consolidations that occurred we have so many entities out there that exist. And then I think JFAC adopted this recommendation around cutting budgets around when they have vacant employee positions that never get filled, but we keep funding those. That's kind of caused some trouble. So I think it's a $60 million savings this year through that. So I think there's more work to be done there to help our state government just be more efficient. There's so many good workers there that have lots of good ideas on the front lines on how to improve state government. I'd love to hear your input as well if you have more ideas, but that's something I want to keep working on.
So just a couple of closing comments here. But first off, please join me in thanking our legislators for taking the time tonight. Government works better when there's this kind of interaction, so we appreciate the questions. Sorry we couldn't get to all of them. I'm sure if you want to ask them some questions when we're done, please do that. There were some questions that were very specific, so I didn't ask them because I wanted it to be more addressed for the group. A couple things to remind you, May 19th is the primary. I'm sure these fine gentlemen would appreciate anyone that would like to help. Please remind your neighbors and others to go out and vote. I think the turnout in the primary election for registered voters is in the 20s, 25 to 28%. It's not great. So we'd love to see as much participation in that as we can. I'm going to put a plug for nuclear. We're with a nuclear company. It's a small nuclear company that is actually turning on the first small reactor before the end of May. So Trump challenged companies to go critical, which means you put nuclear fuel on and you turn it on by July 4th. We have 4 companies in Idaho working on it. I'm fortunate enough to work with one that will be turning it on in May. So there's some great things with nuclear, and hopefully a lot of the question about water use for manufacturing, hopefully those will be paired up with some small nuclear reactors. So we don't have to worry about the water stuff. But that's it. Again, thank you so much for coming out tonight. Our great crowd. We appreciate your time, and hopefully we'll do this again soon.